EcoAdapt.org are an opportunity for the adaptation community to continue the conversations and field evolution that occurs at the National Adaptation Forum. The next forum will be held in May of 2017 in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we hope we'll see all of you there. I'm Laura Hansen, Chief Scientist and Executive Director of EcoAdapt. Today's webinar is a collaboration between EcoAdapt and the Sustainable Remediation Forum on climate change and resilience within remediation. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. Lauren, can I have the next slide, please? While I'm reading them, you can orient yourself to today's webinar. Please make sure to place your phone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce feedback and background noise. And if you're using a computer microphone option, please ensure that you place your computer on mute, even if you're listed as muted when you logged in. We have plenty of time after the presentation for questions and answers. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question function on the GoToWebinar control panel to submit questions to presenters. We'll do our best to answer all of them. You can also raise your hand, which will allow us to unmute you to ask your question directly to our presenter if that is how you'd prefer to proceed. You can also use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be having. We'll do our best again to help you address any problems and ensure that you have a favorable webinar experience. We know sometimes technology can be frustrating. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees. You can send out messages to all as a way to emphasize a point you heard during the presentation or share a resource that you think it's important people know about. We encourage you to use this to engage your colleagues in the audience of this webinar so that it's more of a community experience. Finally, I wanted to let you know that we'll be recording and posting this webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for further viewing. It should be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. Presentations will also be made available online as PDFs on the EcoAdapt site at ecoadapt.org/webinars. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with EcoAdapt, we're a nonprofit organization focused solely on climate change adaptation. We have 5 programs to support the field. The first is the State of Adaptation, where we conduct assessments of what's going on in the field of adaptation so that people know what the state of the field is. We've developed a number of products from that can be found on our website. The second is Awareness to Action, which is a training methodology that we use to help people not only learn how to apply adaptation concepts to their work, but actually to help them develop solutions. Next is the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, something I'm hoping you're all familiar with, which is cakex.org. We refer to it as your online adaptation destination. It's an online database and resource of hundreds of case studies on climate change adaptation. Adaptation consultation is when we go out and help people directly. And finally, the National Adaptation Forum, the entity under which this webinar is run, is a biennial conference that brings together the adaptation sector. Next slide, please. Now, I'm pleased to share facilitation of this webinar with Barbara Mako. She's the Vice President of the Sustainable Remediation Forum U.S. Board of Trustees, and also is my co-moderator for today. Barbara supports private and public sector clients with projects focused on sustainable remediation, redevelopment, and renewable energy generation on impaired lands. Prior to being at SURF, she was at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she served as a senior remedial project manager and greener cleanup coordinator. Her projects have included international and U.S. federal and state Superfund sites, brownfields, and military munitions response sites. She holds a BA in ecological systems and a master's in business administration and sustainable development. So without further ado, Barbara, please take it away.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, EcoAdapt, for co-hosting, and thank you, Laura, for that great introduction. The genesis of this webinar was a meeting by the Sustainable Remediation, or SURF 31, earlier this year on the topic. The conference, SURF 31, was one of our best attended, featuring a broad spectrum of speakers from community-based organizations to senior California regulators and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we discussed the growing threats to public health and environment by climate change impacts on contaminated sites, both those that have already been remediated and those still needing action. These threats to the public health and environment are exacerbated by the increasing amount of environmentally impaired lands globally, particularly in developing nations. So let's look at the highlights, some of the highlights of this SURF 31, today's agenda on the next slide. You know, we're fortunate today to have speakers who are not traditionally part of the sustainable remediation dialogue. Nonprofits such as EcoAdapt, a representative of the legal profession, and the insurance industry. Today we'll also introduce a new SURF research technical initiative and invite your feedback and ideas. But first, a little bit more about SURF on the next slide. We're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. We're a nonprofit, education-focused organization of volunteers working to maximize the overall environmental, societal, and economic benefits from the cleanup and reuse of contaminated sites. We've had 32 meetings already, and we have a number of technical initiatives. Next slide. Since 2006, we've been surfing around the world. The international SURFs that you see here displayed on this map collaborate regularly, including a biennial conference, and they recently organized formally to become the International Sustainable Remediation Alliance, or ISRA. ISRA supports the development of an international sustainable remediation standard and share an interest with us in the topic of climate change and resiliency. Let's look now at some of the challenges from our first speaker, William Wick. Bill will speak on the summary of the legal framework for contaminated site liability. Bill is founding partner of Wachter and Wick Environmental Lawyers. His practice is devoted to environmental counseling and litigation with a focus on assisting clients with all issues related to contaminated land. Bill has more than 38 years of experience in prosecuting, defending, and serving as an expert witness in environmental cases. For the U.S. EPA, Bill served both as an enforcement attorney and chief of the hazardous waste branch for 13 years, which covered all aspects of the number of U.S. laws governing hazardous waste and hazardous materials. Bill received a BA from Northwestern University and a law degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Bill.
Good morning. My presentation will be short and not so sweet, at least if you own contaminated property, and hopefully a remedial primer for those of you involved in the field, but who don't focus on the legal issues. The next slide shows that environmental law, unlike some areas of the law, is concurrent federal and state and local jurisdictions. But the biggest law that's applicable to contaminated sites is the federal Superfund statute. And this slide shows there are basically 6 categories of parties who are liable based on their status for CERCLA cleanup. First, the current owner of a facility, and the current owner is strictly liable, which means in legalese, liable without regard to fault. If you own the property, it doesn't matter that you didn't have anything to do with the contamination that is there. You are liable for cleaning it up. The other legalese that is useful to know is that typically you are also jointly and severally liable, which is to say if there are a number of liable parties, it doesn't matter. You still may be liable for 100% of the cleanup if they are dead or bankrupt or otherwise unavailable to pay. In addition to the current owner liability, a current operator is liable as well. That's broadly defined to mean basically anybody who leases or otherwise occupies property and does something on that property. The circular term of art here in quotation marks is facility. We'll get to that in a minute, but basically that means property or site. The next slide shows the next 4 categories of liable party: past owners and past operators at the time of disposal of hazardous substances, arrangers for disposal, which you commonly hear as the generators who send waste to sites, and transporters. The next slide shows the circle of defenses, and I put that in quotation marks because they are almost always unsuccessful. The most interesting one for today's purposes is the act of God defense, because you could imagine parties arguing that if there is a storm event or flood event or drought event likely caused or engendered by climate change, that you're not liable to deal with the consequences because that's an act of God. The bad news is if you're the landowner, that defense won't work. CERCLA defines an act of God to mean an unanticipated grave natural disaster or other natural phenomenon of an exceptional, inevitable, and irresistible character, and most importantly for our purposes, the effects of which could not have been prevented or avoided by the exercise of due care or foresight. And the cases to date have indicated when parties have tried to argue that floods or heavy storms caused the problem, the courts have said, no, that was foreseeable, and that defense doesn't apply. The next slide shows some defenses that some parties have tried with limited success to apply, basically for current owners to say, I checked out the property, I either didn't find contamination if you're an innocent purchaser, or I found contamination as a bona fide prospective purchaser, but I've taken due care with regard to the property. And those exemptions from liability may work for some landowners, but they only work if you continue to exercise due care with regard to the property. And the next slide shows the kinds of due care steps that you have to take. You have to stop any continuing release, prevent any threatened future release, and prevent any substance release or exposure to people as a result of that. The next slide just highlights the fact that your liability as under CERCLA can also be contractually allocated, at least between other parties. It's not effective against the government. And the next and final slide gets back to that term facility. And it shows how broad the statute is and why I believe that if you don't pay attention to climate change impacts, you will pay for the consequences. When CERCLA was enacted in 1980, nobody was talking about climate change, nobody was talking about sustainability, but the statutory language is so broad and so draconian that you will pay the price if you don't pay attention to sustainability. The term facility, which is the definition from the statute is on this slide, means, and we go down to subpart B, the term facility means any site or area where a hazardous substance has been deposited, stored, disposed of, or placed, or otherwise come to be located. So if your cleaned up site or your site that is not cleaned up gets flooded or otherwise ends up releasing hazardous substances off-site to other properties, your hazardous substance will have otherwise come to be located there, and you will be liable for paying it up, for paying to clean it up. So there's a very good reason for any landowner to pay attention to sustainability issues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, which we've just heard from her, Laura Hansen, who is the Chief Scientist and Executive Director for EcoAdapt. Laura will be speaking on the implications of climate change and contaminated site remediation. Laura's desire for action on climate change led her to co-create EcoAdapt with a team of similarly inclined folks in 2008. She is particularly interested in those areas where the implications of climate change may not yet be considered, including the topic today. Thank you, Laura, for that initiative. Laura serves on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She is a Switzer Environmental Fellow and a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Bronze Medalist. Prior to creating EcoAdapt, she was the Chief Climate Change Scientist for the World Wildlife Fund, creating the World Wildlife Fund's International Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Program, and a research ecologist with the U.S. EPA. Laura was our keynote speaker at SURF 31. Laura?
Thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to get to share this talk again. It was actually very fun to be at the SURF convening. My past history is in toxicology, and so it's always exciting to have the worlds of climate change and toxicology meet. Bill set me up very well on his piece about the need for due diligence for sustainability and climate change in relation to Superfund and other contaminated sites, especially based on the Superfund law. I'm going to share a little bit about what are the implications of climate change for contaminated sites, what are some of the pitfalls that we should be looking out for, and what are some of the opportunities for how we can make things better. Next slide, please. So the quick overview, I'm sure everyone on this call knows the basics of climate change. Temperatures will be rising, precipitation patterns will be changing, which will result in changes like flooding and drought. There'll be increased storminess in many regions, and there'll be sea level rise throughout, as well as more surprising changes in things like ocean acidification. Next slide, please. So the climate change will affect things in two ways. One is that it will affect the contaminants themselves, and the other is that it will affect the site where the contaminants are. So I'll break that down into two pieces. So the aspects of contaminated site remediation that will be affected by climate change include toxicity, both due to the amount of the contaminant that's present because of perhaps changing use patterns or changing availability due to conditions, and the form that the contaminant or toxin is in. Exposure will be changed, including availability and uptake. Sensitivity will be changed because the organism's responses will change based on those other stressors caused by climate change. Transport and fate will change because of changes in environmental mobility for some of these compounds, as per Bill's example. Degradation and transformation can change where things are and how available they are. And then finally, efficacy of the existing practices that we are using to address contaminated sites and remediation efforts may change. Next slide, please. So climate can also undermine remediation in several direct manners, including physical impacts. So changing precipitation patterns, flooding, as Bill mentioned, can lead to mobilization of contaminants, moving them to new places, or just making them available. Drought can result in oxidation of soils. It can decrease dilution, and it can result in a lack of water for treatment. As everyone who works on remediation on this call knows, many of the remediation techniques require water. Sea level rise can result in erosion of the site or inundation of the site, again, potentially mobilizing or introducing contaminants. Extreme weather can lead to scour or flooding. Extreme heat can change the use of the site by wildlife, increase volatility, or if you're working in a polar site, lead to melting of permafrost, which can lead to release or mobilization. Fire can spread contaminants and it can damage site infrastructure. Next slide, please. Additional impacts are that soil treatment approaches can be affected. So bioremediation that requires on bacterial activity may change, especially if there's increasing drought conditions, for example. Land farming and land spreading of soil can be affected by flooding. Groundwater treatment, altered rates of recharge and extraction, both because of changing precipitation patterns, but also changing competitive human demands can have implications for that. There are examples of multiple plumed groundwater and soil and underground soil contamination and how that is changing because of changing precipitation patterns. Removal of contamination materials may become hard to contain during extreme weather events, flooding, or sea level rise. May also just make it hard to use that approach. Engineered in situ solutions such as soil washing are one of the things that can be affected by insufficient water levels. Soil extraction, warmer temperatures may help this by increasing volatility. Natural attenuation, models currently don't necessarily include climate. There's no requirement that that be the case, and so rates may be incorrect. And incineration, emissions allowances may change as a result of our responses to climate change. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, climate change itself can affect toxicity. So decreasing pH can lead to increased toxicity, increased sensitivity of species due to pH stress, and altered transformational rates. One of the benefits we have from the toxicological literature is a pretty broad understanding of what are the implications of changing pH, probably more so than most other fields. Increasing temperature can also really lead to increased toxicity, decreased dissolved oxygen, increased species sensitivity due to heat stress and associated conditions. Altered precipitation patterns can make things wetter or drier, and there are a host of things I've already discussed that go along with that. And then it also can alter degradation rates, both physical and microbial. Extreme weather, similar to the implications of weather above, and human responses to climate change may increase the use of some chemicals and may result in conflicting solutions and changing land use demands, especially as people move in response to things like sea level rise. Next slide, please. So adaptation and thinking about what can be done. I'll start by, for those of you who are new to this field, some definitions. So there are two words, mitigation, which has a completely different word in the world of remediation than it does in the world of climate change. So mitigation is reducing the root cause of climate change through reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This generally has to do with reducing the use of fossil fuels for energy generation and their combustion. Next slide, or next click, please. Adaptation is what we do to limit the current and committed effects of climate change on human and natural systems. So we want to make systems better able to respond or limit the amount of change that they experience locally. Next click, please. So sustainability, therefore, is going to require adaptation. Without adaptation, it will be impossible to have sustainable site remediation. So site remediation practices should plan for changing and future conditions to remain successful for the long term. And if you're not willing to do it for that reason, given what Bill presented in his first talk, you should probably do it simply to make sure that you're not vulnerable to litigation. Next slide, please. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to frame things in terms of three factors or three approaches to climate adaptation. The first is resistance, which are ways that you prevent the site from experiencing change. Below, you can actually see the Superfund site that's closest to my house, which is the Wyckoff site on Bainbridge Island in Washington, and they're working on preventing the impacts of climate change, of sea level rise, by having constructed a very tall containing wall around the site. The second is resilience, and that's ways in which we make sure that the system, that what we're implementing or how we're protecting a Superfund site or a contaminated site can respond to the effects of climate change in site with maintained function. So in this case, that might be improved monitoring to know what's going on so that you can adjust the treatment accordingly. And then finally, response is when you just have to do something dramatically different. And here is an image of an expedited extraction plan because the seas are nearing and action needs to be taken quickly so that that contamination problem doesn't have a much broader impact. Next slide, please. So climate savvy site remediation is sustainability, and I think that's a good frame for thinking about it. So without climate change being explicitly considered in your remediation plan, the near-term efforts may be undermined and long-term goals will be unachievable. That is part of the implications of climate change. One of the tools we use to talk about climate change is vulnerability. And vulnerability can be thought of in terms of the sensitivity of the site plus the exposure. So how much change it likes versus plus how much change it can experience minus how much change it can withstand. That's the adaptive capacity. So to do adaptation, what you want to do is decrease the amount of sensitivity, so control the sensitive features of the site, decrease the amount of exposure, allow the site to experience less change, and increase adaptive capacity, prepare the site and the design of the treatment regime for change. EPA uses this graphic to symbolize the same thing. So they want you to evaluate system vulnerability and implement adaptation measures, and obviously have a monitoring and reevaluation component so that you know what's going on. Next slide, please. So I've already talked a little bit about that Wyckoff site that I showed in the first slide. It's a creosote site vulnerable to sea level rise, and the image below shows how much of it could be lost with sea level rise. So the plan there is to build more of a wall like that and to come up with an extraction method. Next slide, please. Another example of resilience this time is a plan to protect the Clark Fork River Basin. The Clark Fork River Basin is an interesting scenario in that it has a contaminated site on it, and in this case they're developing strategies that not only can respond to change but are also being done with a large regional stakeholder community. So that the entire community is part of developing the plan, in part because it substantially affects the local economy, which is based on things like fishing in the Clark Fork River. Next slide, please. The final example is one of response, and this is from Laysan Island in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. It was a site that was contaminated with carbofuran, and it was in a dynamic and inaccessible location. Laysan is very remote. It also happens to be the home of a number of endangered species, including the Laysan teal, the Laysan duck, and the Hawaiian monk seal. It was very toxic to the bird species, and the response that needed to be taken there because of things like sea level rise and potential even warmer, drier conditions was that the contaminant the area was dug up and removed completely from the island. Next slide, please. So there are many tools out there for getting information around climate change and contaminated sites. This is a number of the tools that are available on the EPA site. Some of them can be used to assess sea level rise or changing climatological conditions, like the Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness tool. Next slide, please. And then there is a super fun climate change adaptation website. There's a national stormwater calculator, which is useful, and assorted technical fact sheets, including one on landfill, groundwater, and sediment from 2014 that is specifically about climate change. Next slide, please. And with that, I will wrap it up. If people have further questions or want more information, check out Chapter 14 of Climate Savvy, which is entirely about regulating pollutants in a changing world. And there'll be time for questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Our next speaker is Gregory Schultz, who will speak on Insurance Solutions Environmental. Like the previous speakers, Greg is an expert in his field. He works currently for JLT Specialty USA as Executive Vice President and Environmental Leader. Greg's a specialist in environmental risk transfer and mitigation and has provided environmental risk consulting for clients for the last 29 years. He works with clients with a wide range of backgrounds, from real estate owners and developers to private equity. He is a pioneer in the structuring of long-term liability management solutions. Greg?
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. And I guess I'm going to be trying to cross over between what Bill has set up in his talk about the tenets of environmental liability according to the law, and what Laura had talked about in terms of climate change and the risks there and some of the mitigation techniques that can be utilized. But where insurance comes into play, I think, is to actually be able to transfer those risks and how, if in fact we can't prevent them and they do occur, how do we best address them? Next slide, please. I take a little more practical approach as to how I would consult with clients and look at, who has a liability. And really anybody that I'd say that has a footprint, or is in Bill's terminology, a facility. And that is, whether it's from an operational exposure, that they are currently a business doing whatever type of operations on their sites, and it creates a pollution condition, to a company that buys a property and or buys a company and doesn't have a full picture or has unknown issues that arise after they buy that property that they then discover and have liability for. The second area is just, when you've got an environmental condition and dealing with the remediation or the cleanup and all the liabilities that arise out of that, which are beyond necessarily always the known conditions. And then thirdly, just regular construction projects, what anybody's doing out there in their normal course of business, and how they are either building new facilities or expanding their facilities, and the types of environmental impacts that they may encounter doing the construction. Next slide, please. In the crossroads here is of resiliency and remediation, and how does insurance play a role into whether climate change and resiliency increases that risk or lowers that risk? Does that have a change in the risk of the profile of the risk? And thirdly, are there specific insurance products which actually address greenhouse gas effects or climate change, global warming? Next slide, please. I think we first talk a little bit about the state of the environmental insurance market. There's been so much recently in the news about some of the more dramatic changes, and if we go to the next slide, we can talk about in the top part where AIG, very prominent insurer, just recently left the insurance marketplace for environmental insurance offerings, Chubb and ACE combined. And so there was a fairly significant retraction and reduction in capacity by those two markets leaving. However, even with those fairly dramatic departures, we still see that there's probably an upwards of over 500 million in limits available in the marketplace today. Really still very, very competitive. And all of these programs that we're talking about from an environmental insurance perspective are highly tailored and what we call manuscripted policy forms, addressing the specific risks for each project or each client. And even though with that change that has occurred in the market in terms of the vacating by AIG and the combination of Chubb and ACE, the pricing has remained relatively steady. In fact, it's continued to decrease in many instances. So we see a very stable market. We see a market that's very competitive, both for, as we use the term, ongoing operations of a company, as well as the transactional setting where a client buying or selling a property. The market's still very receptive. And what we see is that, the policies for environmental insurance are somewhat unique in that they are usually written for multi-year policy terms. You're not buying the insurance each year, renewing it each year like you may do with your general liability or property insurance. These are longer-term policies, up to 10 years, in fact, for some sites and some conditions. And we have a separate sort of subset of insurers that are offering a very unique type of coverage, which we call excess indemnity, which means basically if you're a client that's buying a property or buying a company and the seller's providing to you an indemnity for various environmental liabilities that may be associated with the site, both known or unknown, and to the extent that the insurer is willing to provide excess coverage over that indemnity and what we call drop-down coverage, meaning that in the event that the indemnitor fails to respond on their indemnity to you, the buyer, then the insurance actually steps up and fills that gap and pays for those indemnities that otherwise would have been paid by the indemnitor. Certainly, there's a higher degree of underwriting skills that have to be applied in terms of evaluating the creditworthiness of the indemnitor company, but certainly it is something that's readily available, and we've been using it in many instances in the transactional setting. One of the other features is that these policies generally are available to be assigned, meaning that if you're an owner of a particular asset and you have an environmental insurance program in place and you want to sell that asset, the policies are transferable to a new owner. So it can be viewed as an enhanced value to the asset. Although it's available, we tend to recommend that we do not assign policy, but rather just add the buyer to the policy, as the seller still has tail liability for that property, as Bill pointed out, under circular liability. So there's many different features that we can build into these programs, and I think in the next page, if we turn to that, we can look at a couple of those. And while I would like to add that we have, risks on the right side, whether it's vapor intrusion. We hear a lot about drinking water quality, bacteria, mold, bed bugs, biological agents, bioterrorism, cyber terrorism. All are leading to more and increased liabilities that can include environmental damages, which these policies are being designed and addressed to cover. On the left side, however, there are some companies, some insurance companies that have had some retraction in terms of their appetite. Some companies are not wanting to write sites that are being redeveloped, such as brownfields or heavy industrial sites, but for the most part, we still have a competitive market. So just to say that I think that there's a lot of noise out there right now about what environmental insurance market is doing and how well it's doing. I can assure you that it's still very competitive with lots of limits still available and a lot of flexibility that's being offered by the carriers. So next slide, please. So we've talked about the market. Let's talk about the products. Really, next slide is just to show you there's sort of three general categories. Number one, many people have heard pollution legal liability, or sometimes referred to as environmental impairment liability, and that's really the site liability policy. For a site to be insured for risks of environmental damage, whether known or unknown, and being covered under a policy. Number two is cost cap insurance. Cost cap insurance is a very unique policy coverage. It was very popular in the early 2000s through the mid 2000s. It kind of went away because of bad loss history, but it's back, and we're writing that again to provide for coverage of remediations of contamination on sites and the potential cost overrun. So it's really what we call a first-party cover, meaning that it's just covering the cost overruns that may be incurred by the owner for a remediation of a site. We'll talk a little bit more about this as well. And then the third one is contractor's pollution liability. This is really where, anybody that you hire to do work and services for you, whether it's a vendor, a contractor, a construction contractor, that they have the potential to cause damage to your property or your employees, and that they should have environmental coverage for them as well. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, pollution legal liability really is a site liability policy. It covers third party, meaning it's bodily injury, property damage, NRD, natural resource damages, and really the other important one is business interruption. If you have a cessation of your business because of an environmental contamination issue, and you've got to either remediate, decontaminate, evacuate, all of these things lead to a cessation of your business and loss of revenue, and that's one of these features under these policies that can be covered. Defense costs are also covered. They are within the limit, and one should always be aware of how much limit to buy based on defense costs being included. And one of the other things, as Bill mentioned, is the disposal site liability, and this is also something that can be addressed and covered under these policies to the extent that you've disposed of hazardous waste or waste products in landfills, and or you had hired somebody to transport those to those facilities and did not retain responsibility or did not have the financial capability to address the response for cleanup, that would come back to you as a site owner or generator, and that's where this pollution policy can cover you for that liability. Next slide. And I mentioned earlier, one of the topics that's very much emerging today, or it's been talked about quite a bit, is mold. These policies can address mold coverage, both the remediation as well as the bodily injury. We also are covering lead-based paint, asbestos, where it's found not to have been intended to be applied, such as groundwater and soils. So, contrary to, I think, what a lot of folks have talked about, lead and asbestos not being able to be covered. In fact, we can get the coverage for them under the pollution legal liability policy. Illicit abandonment, emergency response costs, and crisis response. Crisis response is a big factor right now for a lot of companies where, their public relations is a huge factor, and the quicker that they can have resources to help them mitigate or manage the media response, it's been very beneficial from a reputational perspective, and many of these policies do include the costs associated with that crisis response management. Next slide.
Hi, Greg,
I mentioned before,
Barbara. Maybe after this next slide, then we can perhaps discuss more insurance, very enlightening during question and answer. Thank you.
Sure. So cost cap insurance, simply, as I said earlier, is a first-party cost overrun insurance. So if you are involved with remediation projects and you need to clean them up, this is designed to cover the excess costs if they go over what's expected. Next slide. And then just lastly, contractors' pollution, as I mentioned as well. It's the third party that you hire to do work for you on your site, and to the extent that their work causes a pollution condition, that there is the ability to have that policy respond for those damages or cleanup costs that are incurred by that work that the contractor has performed. Next slide. And the last one, just really I want to mention, is I think the exposure to directors and officers and the corporate level of the companies. We're finding more and more that Ds and Os are exposed to environmental liability. There's courts that are now finding liability and are imposing that back to the directors and officers. And directors and officers insurance has usually excluded environmental damages. So it's just another issue to be aware of as an evolving issue where if properly structured pollution policies are in place, this kind of exposure to the Ds and Os could be mitigated. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Very enlightening. I'm pretty sure we're going to have some questions on insurance for the during the question and answers. So let me briefly introduce you to a new SURF, a research technical initiative. We're excited about this initiative. It builds on what you've heard today and at our recent SURF 31, an opportunity to reduce some of the public health and environmental risks that Bill and Laura and Greg have talked about, satisfy the Paris climate change agreements, and create value for communities. So in the next slide, we'll talk about kind of the building blocks for this new technical initiative. We'll be looking to past SURF accomplishments, particularly on groundwater conservation and reuse. The principles and case studies really have applications in California, in the United States, particularly on long-term stress on water availability and abroad. We also plan to build on SURF's most recent accomplishment, integrating the social dimension. And this white paper is very cool. We all know the importance of stakeholder engagement, but we have some tools now, such as the Social Sustainability Evaluation Matrix. And we're fortunate in our new TI research to have leaders of both of these SURF initiatives as part of our team. The next slide continues to look at our research approach. We have a great public-private sector team, private, global, and small businesses, and the public sector from state, federal government, including regulators. We plan to examine all aspects of the site remediation that Laura mentioned, from site assessment to operation and maintenance, and the potential climate change impacts. portraying these impacts in a conceptual site model. We'll look at predictive models, federal, state, regional, that have best applicability for site managers. UC Berkeley has a model for urban resiliency that we have access to. We'll test tools, briefly mentioned by Laura, U.S. Climate Change Resilience Toolkit, recent DoD documents, kind of adapting them, recommending adaptations to sustainable remediation and redevelopment principles. We'll look at social equity and the impact on the most vulnerable populations. We'll be culling case studies, remote sites, and urban sites. And how will we be, how can we quantify the benefits of rehabilitated sites? The next slide gives us two case studies. The first comes from United Kingdom. A former hospital site is now a wetland park, and they have quantified close to $16 million saved in flood prevention, protecting hundreds of houses, scores of industry and businesses, and 2 social clubs, both flood prevention and public health benefits. The second case study comes here in the U.S. in renewable energy on deployed land, especially in the Northeast, especially Massachusetts, that has enacted regulations, policy, and incentives for these community-based enterprises. As one of the team members on our TI team says, they're really ATMs for local communities. So the next step, real briefly, in the next slide, we're going to be continuing next week. Our team will be meeting again, refining our outlook, really developing partnerships too within the remediation industry and outside. We'll be submitting an abstract for consideration at working session at the forum that Laura mentioned next year. We'll be continuing the dialogue with you. A second webinar is planned, and the U.S. EPA has agreed to speak. Our research, case studies, recommendations will be in the form of a SURF white paper to be issued within the next 2 years. Please contact me for more information. And the next slide, and to join our team and to join SURF. The next slide, we share with all of us, I'm sure share with the World Bank, that contaminated sites can be resilient for the environment and the community and engines for economic development. At this point, we'd love to take your questions.
Okay, and it looks like we have had quite a number of questions. Alex and Lauren, is there anybody who raised their hand? Okay.
Not yet, Laura. Not yet.
Okay.
Nobody has raised their hands, but
okay, great. Then I'm going to read. Yep, I have the questions that you sent. So, people have been submitting questions through the chat. Please continue to do so. The first question looks like it is for our legal expert, Bill. If someone inherits polluted land, they're responsible for cleanup. Specifically, say someone's uncle dies, they inherit his property, which they find is polluted with 80 years of foundry waste. Are they responsible for cleanup, or does that responsibility only come into play if they try to transfer ownership to another party? Does this depend on the state in which the land is located?
It does not depend on the state in which the land was located, except under state law. Under CERCLA, the federal Superfund law, there is a limited exemption for inherited property, but you would need to consult a lawyer in your specific circumstance. But I can tell you from my own experience, I had a client who didn't even know she inherited property and inherited what became a landfill. And she was liable even though she inherited the property. So the working presumption should be that you are likely liable.
Okay, we have another perhaps related question. We have a brownfield site located next to our river, the Milk River, and if we develop adjacent land, old water treatment plant, for a community park or a recreation area, like a baseball field, we may need to look into putting in a levee or to add on to the existing dike that was made for 2 evaporation ponds that were installed for the old water treatment plant. That may be used as a brownfield site, and it is already located next to an existing brownfield site. Since this site is within a floodplain zone A, is installing a levee or adding to an existing dike will be allowable and ensure success of the project. Oh, I guess they're asking if they use a levee or add to an existing dike. From my perspective, it would be hard to say without knowing the exact risk level. So how much flooding is expected and what is the height of the levee or dike? Anyone else have a comment on that question? Oh, actually, it goes on.
Go ahead.
Will installing these flood protection measures ensure success of the project, and is it allowable? The allowable part I don't know the answer to, but my other answer stands. Go ahead, Barbara.
I would say definitely work with the regulators in charge of the cleanup for those sites. But there is a great example that I just learned about last week on the Hoboken, which has suffered flooding during a Superstorm Sandy. And they were able to develop a project which remediation, and got funding for remediation that includes a multi-level structure, stormwater management at the bottom, and parking and a community park, community needs. So, definitely work with the stakeholders, particularly the regulators in charge of the cleanup of the site. I don't know, Bill, if you want to add anything to that.
Okay, there was a question about how did the carbofuran get to Laysan. One of the things about, that's actually a mystery in some manner. However, many things float up on the beach at Laysan. It is littered with plastic and glass, floating glass debris like bottles. One of the theories is that one or two barrels of carbofuran may have washed up on shore. And then since they are made of metal, not plastic or glass, they rusted away, and the site became contaminated. But the actual source, I'm not certain, has been determined. Okay, another question. John Wiener was hoping that someone will note the problem of old industrial contamination in coastal and riverine cities, where contaminants have generally been immobile due to redevelopment with impermeable surfaces and stormwater drainages. Are these contaminants now being mobilized by saltwater intrusion with sea level rise and intentional increased infiltration as improved stormwater quality and flow rate management? Barbara, do you have any examples of that?
Yes, that is happening. We had a case study of that at SURF 31 and is certainly being discussed. You'll see it also on the EPA website. So perhaps that's a topic for our next webinar on some case studies and how that's being addressed and the opportunities to further mitigate the risk.
Excellent. Okay, next question. Facility B definition excluded hazardous substances as consumer products and consumer use. Does this imply that the type of substances in use is not relevant to later reuse or purchase of a facility? What does this mean? Like an active dry cleaner could be purchased where TCE is in use because it was used as a consumer product in a consumer process. Sustainability wants me to go to a chemical-free process, so I buy the property and change the process to eliminate that consumer product, and now I have a property that is contaminated with TCE. What's the liability? Bill, I think that's all in your court, although there might be an interesting insurance component there as well.
Yeah, you would be liable, and the consumer product exception is a very narrow exception. And the dry cleaner circumstance, for example, would not be considered a consumer product. You're using solvents in a dry cleaning product. The actual suit might be a consumer product that you had dry cleaned, but the PCE wastewater and the PCE contamination at the facility would subject you to normal CERCLA liability. And there's a whole line of cases about whether sales of, used products or products create liability or not. Again, generally, your working presumption needs to be you're almost certainly going to be liable.
Greg, is there any sort of insurance component to that sort of transfer of property issue?
Yeah, there is. In fact, there's a number of markets that have had a development of what we basically call products pollution coverage. So to the extent that there's an actual product that has either components that would be deemed hazardous, such as a lot of electronic components have metals in them, and they function properly, but when they're disposed of, they create a problem with where they're being disposed of, and so there's a products pollution exposure for that, and there's coverage for that now as well. So that is an available risk transfer of a liability for environmental out of the products.
And would something like that have any sort of clause in it for how the insurance would change over time given climate change? There's
nothing in any of the pollution policies that have a exclusion or restriction due to climate change. There's of course, always a fortuitous event that's required for an insurance policy to be triggered. It cannot be expected, as an example, but to the extent that right now, there would be no exclusions, and certainly coverage should apply under those policies.
Okay. Another question. Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Sorry, excuse me. If I may, as one of the co-facilitators, if I can follow up, Greg, on that question. And first, I want to tell everyone that we will answer your questions if we don't get to them during this webinar. But stay tuned for the second webinar because we'll provide some answers to them. But Greg, could the model of the California earthquake insurance policies apply to owners of contaminated sites and climate-related high-risk areas, where a higher premium and then a lower if you make improvements that minimize your risk? Do you see any application?
I mean, yeah, and that's a great question. To further the dialogue around this, the pollution policies also do not have any kind of exclusions or restrictions for acts of God, whether it's flood, whether it's earthquakes. And so to the extent that those occur and they cause some sort of pollution condition or release, those are covered under these types of policies for the pollution cleanup and or bodily and property damage. There is, though, certainly consideration by the underwriters that if a location is in a high risk area for earthquake, there's probably an additional impact to premium and how much they're going to charge versus an area that's low impact, or where a building's been built with special considerations for earthquake measures and engineering, or a seawall's been built for prevention of flood. Those are definitely aspects that underwriters take in consideration, and it does reflect in the premium.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've run out of our time. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you especially to the audience. Laura, did you want to finish our goodbye, and we will address your questions in future webinars?
Absolutely. If you did not get your question answered, or you had your hand up and we're going to ask a question, please enter your question into the chat or the questions, and we will be providing answers to those questions. As Barbara said, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you for the wonderful panel who provided information that, even though I have heard them speak once before, I got to learn more this time. This webinar and all other National Adaptation Forum webinars are recorded and can be found on the forum website, nationaladaptationforum.org, or on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, cakex.org. If you have suggestions for another webinar topic, please feel free to send it our way at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. And as Barbara mentioned, there will be a second, at least one more, webinar in this series on sustainable remediation and climate change, but we look forward to providing topics and content on any number of issues. We also look forward to submissions to the National Adaptation Forum. The call for proposals will be opening up in the coming month. So again, thank you all for joining us today.